Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Get Out of Rap. Today, I'm joined by Peter Krykant, who is project lead at Cranston, a charity organisation. And I reached out to, horrible term, reached out, and then I contacted Peter after seeing his story on LinkedIn, because I just thought, I know it's one that all of you guys as listeners will absolutely love. And Peter very thankfully agreed to come on. Peter, thank you very much for doing this.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for asking me, Martin. It's a real pleasure to join you today.
And we're going to dive into your story, but I'm a bit nervous because I'm not sure I can step up to the plate, because you were telling me beforehand you're often now in the media and BBC, Victoria, Derbyshire, but you've come back to your roots, as it were, to do a podcast about contact centres.
Yeah, I mean, when you first reached out, Martin, I was a little bit taken aback, because obviously, you know, my story, it's one of homelessness and drug dependency, you know, early childhood trauma. But in recent years, you know, like you say, I've done a lot of media, a lot of TV, a lot of radio interviews, a lot of podcasts as well. But really, when I look back, you know, my career started in the contact center industry. You know, in 2004, you know, I had a bit of time where I had a bit of stability. You know, I had a place to live in Brighton, and you know, a bit of stability away from sort of the drug dependency that was linked to, you know, my childhood trauma and my homelessness. And I went and applied for a job, and I got a job in a contact center, and that was in early 2005. And a story I often hear, you know, from a lot of people, an old friend who I was talking to on the phone, who I worked with at Domestic in General in the outbound team. He's still there 17 years later. You know, I found myself still working in the contact center industry 11 years later. And, you know, and all the stuff that I do now, all the media, the podcasts, the TV, all of that comes from a core base of what I learned in the contact center industry.
And that's lovely to hear, and often overlooked. By that, do you mean the communication skills and how to show up? And
yeah, well, I've got a little story I'll tell you. So I showed up for my interview. I had to declare my criminal convictions at that point, because I was also involved in the criminal justice system. So I was surprised when I got offered the job. I was 2 weeks into the job, and I didn't obviously know this at the time, but the woman who was to become my wife had friends in the contact centre that I worked in Brighton and Domestic in General. I didn't meet her until 2009, sorry, and I started there in 2005. And one of her friends, a guy called Dave, was my line manager on the academy section. Again, didn't know this at the time, obviously, but I was just in the job 2 weeks. I was still on the probation period, 2 weeks into the job, and you were told, you know, as you're told at the beginning, you know, you need to empathize, you need to build rapport with the customers, you know, you need to talk about what it is that they're interested in. And somebody was talking about, it was a Sky product at the time, Sky Repair Protect plan. And one of the customers was talking about how something was bull SHIT. I don't know if we can swear on here, but I try not to these days. And I reflected that back to him. I said, yeah, that is kind of bull SIHT. And obviously I was pulled up for that in one of the call recordings. You know, and I was really nervous. I thought I was going to lose my job. You know, obviously swearing as a no-no in that environment, but I had no experience. You know, like the world that I came from previous to that, you know, conversations were pretty limited. You know, and growing up in Scotland, you know, like a lot of our chat is punctuated by swear words. But thankfully, Dave said, you know, this is just a learning curve. Yeah, it sounded really good and your rapport was really good. You just can't use swear words, even if the customer uses those swear words. So, you know, that was a massive learning curve, like that communication skills, and how to, empathize with customers, and the more experience that I got, and then I worked in retentions, and people calling up, to book repairs, and understanding, certainly, at certain times of the year, if you've got Christmas coming up and your cooker breaks down, how important that is to somebody, like if you've got family, a large family, and you've got kids and your washing machine breaks down, how important it is to get somebody out to repair that, and understanding that people in certain financial situations, can't afford to go out and buy a new appliance, but they can afford a couple of pounds a month to protect that appliance, and all these things that I learned, and things that I use now every day in life all grew from that job, and I look back now and as an employer, domestic in general were absolutely amazing, and some of my biggest achievements I'm sure we'll go on to talk about hopefully later on in the podcast, but I've got some great memories of some of the things that I achieved, and I was catching up on some of your other podcasts, maybe we'll talk a little bit about attrition levels, and incentives and targets and stuff as we go on.
And do you, in your post, you were very open about, and you mentioned it there, the world you're in beforehand. Is it important to you then to share that story? And at what point did you think I'm going to start talking about where I was before in order to? And I love that there's a phrase in your post about how empowering people can empower change. But was there a moment where you thought it's going to benefit others to share my story?
Yeah, I suppose that's been a gradual process for me. I think the power of example, the power of shared experiences with other people is beneficial. And I think if somebody sees, that somebody who has been homeless, who has been injecting drugs in really horrible conditions in alleyways and abandoned buildings, has that opportunity and can change and can move forward, and can get a job to begin with, in the contact center industry, get married, have children. If people see those stories, it becomes more of a realistic goal for others, I think, and it also, I think, breaks down the stigma associated with homelessness and drug dependency, because I think there's always a story underlying, problematic drug use, and involvement with the criminal justice system, because the way that we deal with drugs in the United Kingdom, automatically leads people into that criminal justice system, which can actually just traumatize people more, rather than, what happened to me was I was able to get a job, I was able to get into education, I was able to, grow my experiences in life. So I think being open is something that, has hopefully helped, because I have got quite a large profile, and I've campaigned a lot for changes to the way that we deal with these issues for people who are going through similar experiences to what I went through in the late 90s. We're still often treating people the same way, where other countries have really changed direction with this stuff, and decriminalized, drug use, and offer people support and help rather than sending people to prison or, punishing people.
We were talking beforehand about it's a subject close to my heart as well, around I spent some time volunteering for an outreach organization, and it always amazed me how difficult it was to navigate, whether it was access to housing, other welfare, support needed to get back into employment, or to deal with addiction, that even as someone who had a home to go to at the end of my time on shift, if you like, I had a home to go to, and I found, but I still came away thinking it's so difficult. It's things aren't made easy, and that's with someone who has a home and can leave it behind and go, right, I'm back out again Tuesday night. For people that were living out on the streets, to be able to then navigate the bureaucracy alone, I just thought was astounding. And we don't make it easy to help people get up.
Yeah, we don't. And if you've got a lack of basic skills, in terms of a lack of skills around reading or writing, or if you've kind of grew up in an area where education's not been a priority, and you've maybe been in and out of school, it's even harder to navigate. There's a percentage of people who have those challenges that are even harder for some individuals. And I think that's where it's really important that organizations are set up and charities are set up to really give people that basic support, that ability to get into basic education. Again, I'm not sure if I said this earlier, Martin, but when I went for my job interview with Domestic and General, I was able to access a grant for £100. It was actually vouchers, it wasn't money, which was fine because that gave me had enough vouchers to go and buy a shirt, a tie, a suit, and a pair of shoes. That was in early 2005. It was just enough money to look smart, get well dressed, and go for the interviews. And I'd had a couple of interviews already. Obviously I hadn't been successful. So when I was successful for that one, I was, as I say, I was really taken back and shocked. But I was given basic support. At that point, the organisation that I was able to access the vouchers through, they also supported me with the CV, because the way it works is with criminal convictions, you've got 7 years that usually for most basic level convictions that you have to declare them for. And had I not had that support, I would have just declared all my criminal convictions. I didn't need to do that because certain convictions were spent under the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act. So sometimes it's those things that people don't even know, that can help and support them. And it's not being dishonest. I wouldn't say it's being dishonest. It's the way the system is set up. People have rehabilitation. There's rehabilitation available for people. I mean, now I don't declare, if I was to be going for a new job, I don't declare any of my criminal convictions, because they were 21, 22 years ago now. And I have a certificate for protection of vulnerable groups that I can actually work with, vulnerable groups of children or adults. But some people probably wouldn't even know that unless they're given the support to do so, and to understand what they can say and can't, what they need to say and what they don't need to say when it comes to applying for jobs and stuff.
What was your mindset like when you were making that transition? You must have had so much fortitude to think, I'm going to go for interviews. Were you expecting people to say no, sorry, or what was your mindset like?
Well, I mean, I hadn't worked for so many years. Obviously that was May 2005 when I actually started working in the contact centre. And I think previous to that, my last official job would have been in the mid to late 90s before I left Scotland. So you're probably looking at about 7 or 8 years where there was a big gap with no employment history at all. Obviously having to declare criminal convictions, I didn't have much hope at that point, that I was going to be able to find a job. And I was, again, a little bit taken aback that I actually even got offered a job, and especially in the industry that I was working in, the contact center industry, because I was working with people, and we were collecting people's bank details, and we were selling products to people, and that requires a basic level of trust, doesn't it? So, actually looking back on it now, we've got organizations out there that are doing great work, organizations like Timson's, who, are employing people coming out of the prison system, I think organizations like Iceland, who are also doing the same. But actually, when I look back, Domestic in General, way back in 2005, gave me that opportunity, so certainly ahead of the game in many ways, in terms of what often people need is just a chance, it's just a chance, just an opportunity. And I grabbed that opportunity with both hands, I would probably still be in the contact center industry now if it wasn't for the fact that I'd done a bit of stay-at-home dadding, and actually I think I was the first person in Domestic in General to take 6 months paternity leave. The man and the woman can split the maternity leave now, and June the 1st, 2011, when I was still working at D&G, my oldest son was born, and my wife took the first 6 months and I took the second 6 months. And then, obviously I went back to work after that 6 months, and then we moved to Scotland in 2013. That was the only reason for leaving that organisation. And when we moved back to Scotland, I worked in the contact centre industry again. I worked for Sky and a couple of other smaller contact centres in Glasgow. And then my second son was born, and I became a stay-at-home dad, and I stayed at home for nearly a year. And while I was at home, I decided this is when I got the idea, I can use my own history, my own experiences of homelessness, addiction, maybe get a job. So I started volunteering for a little organisation locally, and that led to an offer of a job, and that again changed my direction in life slightly. But it was that opportunity, it was that chance, and it was that skill base, that learning, and a great, fantastic 8 years of my life. As I say, I met my wife in the gym in Brighton, the gym LA Fitness, and we just got chatting one day. And Domestic in General were one of the biggest employers in Brighton at the time. There was probably around 500 or 600 people employed there, and she knew a couple of people that worked there. That previous story about Dave, who was my first team leader on the academy section, and another guy called Steve, who actually I ended up being a team leader with on the same campaign. And we were all just camping together down in Hertfordshire in the summer, myself and my wife and Steve, and so I look back and just changed my life, Martin, and that's why I was so pleased to come on this, because I don't think that often the contact center, call center industry gets a good press, and actually a well-run contact center and a well-run organization do some great work and give some great opportunities to people. And I believe that it can be a great place to work. One of my biggest achievements that I was proud of as a team leader in Domestic in General was I went a full year without a leaver on my team. 16,
That's great.
16 people, and 12 months without any leavers on my team. Because attrition levels can be high. But I always made sure that I was trying to make people feel as comfortable as possible, and I managed outbound sales teams for a long time, but we had inbound teams, a couple of people that came onto my team who, they weren't natural sellers, but they were great. On the phones themselves, they were great at chatting to people, they were great at, listening and rapport building, but they just weren't natural sellers. So, those are the sorts of people that, rather than say, you're not any good for us, is you would transfer those people, you know, you would see if there were spaces on the inbound teams, because you know there's always opportunities for people to grow and develop in this environment.
If you think about there's so much there that I love. If you think about our industry now as well, we are struggling with bringing on customer facing agents, if you want to call them that, kind of, and thinking about your journey, and it definitely resonates with a lot of the people I worked alongside, and then as I progressed to a team leader, managed people who came, who felt like we'd taken a chance on them, were so committed. Once they got over this, I was talking about a guy I managed before. He shared with me that for a period up to his probation, he felt paranoid that at some point someone would come and say, "Oh, actually, you don't have any GCSEs and you didn't really have a job before this, so sorry, you've got to go." He said once he came out, we alleviated that by reassurance and training and commitment to help his career. He was the most committed member of the team, absolutely 100% streets ahead of other people who probably felt like, oh, why am I here? I don't want to be in a contact center. Whereas I call him Rich. Whereas Rich was just always there, the life and soul of the team, right behind any campaign we had, and went and still is in the industry, having a fantastic career. And I think, you know, you said then the domestic in general ahead of the game when they employed you. That's the kind of thing that we need to be doing, is giving people a chance and thinking, rather than finding reasons to say no, find reasons to go, well, there's potential here. How can we mold it? Because like you said, a well-run contact center is a great place to start your career.
It is. And, you know, so I think back then, you know, we had so much fun, you know, it was a young, lively environment, you know, and that, I think that was part of the reason why I was able to go long periods of time without people, you know, wanting to leave, because we had fun, you know. It was like we done sports relief, you know, comic relief, taking calls, you know, we got pizzas in for people, you know, we always ran, you know, incentives, you know, and a lot of the times incentives were based around alcohol back in those days, you know, like I'm sure it's not the same these days, but you know,
well,
but you know, in a city like Brighton, you know, and lots of young people, you know, that was the types of, it was always about what types of incentives people want, you know, what do you want? And one of my favorites that I loved running, you know, and I would usually run it over the course of a month, you know, and it wouldn't always be on, you know, although I was outbound sales team leader, you know, it wouldn't always be on sales, it would be on, you know, various different aspects of calls in terms of call quality, etc. You know, and what the incentive basically was you know, there'd be a point system, and over the course of the month, you know, we would run the incentive, and the person who wins the incentive would actually get a day's paid holiday, but they wouldn't have to use the holiday, and I would go on the phones for them for the day, and then any sales that I made would go towards their sales targets and their sales commissions. But if I didn't make any sales, it wouldn't impact them, because I would be logged in delivering through my own login, you know, so that rise somebody's, not only give them a day off where they can go away and they don't have to use a day's holiday, but it could also massively impact their commission in terms of their sales, because obviously I was putting those sales towards their commission structures without impacting their actual logged in time. So, and I think that was one of the best things that I did, because, you know, I think certainly as you move through the contact center industry and you move from that sort of teammate to team leader, you know, that can be a transition period, you know, of, you know, like all of a sudden you're expected to manage people, you know, you're expected to set targets, you know, listening, call quality, coaching, development, and coming from teammate to team leader. I think one of the things that I seen is sometimes people can forget, the challenges of the day-to-day role can be challenging. The if you're going through a difficult period, and you're not achieving, your targets and stuff. And sometimes management can forget that. So I would always like to make sure that I didn't forget that, that I remembered that. And I think that helps so much when you're doing like regular one-to-ones and regular coaching and development sessions, and you're running incentives and running, the team how you would want your manager to manage you, so yeah.
It's a real, I mean, we have I was outbound. That was my first few years, was outbound as an agent, and then outbound as a team leader and then manager. And I'm with you. I used to get frustrated with the higher ups who would come down and go, what's going on with sales today? And why isn't Vicky selling? Like there was some, oh, I forgot to press the sales button. There we go. I pressed it. It should be fine now.
Yeah, exactly.
But
and I think one of the important things for me was, not standing over people. Like I think, especially with people who are natural sort of sellers, the people who, those people who are just kind of like come in every day and they do their job and they get on with it and they're, great at selling. It would just be stand back and allow them to do what they want to do.
Yeah.
Like as long as the call quality is there, as long as they're not mis-selling, just let them get on with the job. And then I could focus a little bit more, because there was people who I was in the unfortunate position a couple of times over the years of, managing academy, people who, just couldn't do the job, because it takes a certain person to pick up the phone and build rapport and talk to customers, whether that be inbound or outbound. For me, it's a certain type of person that's really good at the job. And I was in the unfortunate position of having to let people go on a couple of occasions. But I would do everything I could to support the people where, as and when I could, to move people into other departments, into other inbound rather than outbound, because it can be a challenge. It can be a challenge if
massively so. And I think people forget, even the most successful team members, 90% of their day is still rejection, and that the toll that has on people's mentality. For me, it was always, once you got over the kind of, I've always thought it's two things. The first one was getting over that point where you ask for the sale. People would do great up until then and go, right, should we proceed? And you could see them, I don't know whether it's a British thing or it was just that kind of nervousness around going, right, now get it.
Yeah,
once people got over that one, the next hurdle I think was so important was just that mentality of knowing that you've done a good job, but it hasn't happened, and being able to just put that to one side and then move on straight away, literally with no break. You could have come home at the end of the day. Do you have a good day? Well, 90% of my day was people telling me no, or even worse, so that kind of resilience.
Totally, yeah, and it does take a high level of resilience. You're right. I mean, I don't know, somebody in those days, in my early days at D&G, somebody could be probably making 100 calls a day, outbound calls a day, and the target would probably be about 10 sales. So you're right, about 90% of the day would be rejection. So it does take a level of stamina. It takes a level of determination, to be in that outbound world. But I think also in the inbound stuff as well, like it can be very challenging at times. People are often certainly, in sort of stuff that I was involved in terms of appliances and central heating and that type of area, people can often be in crisis, you know, like if your central heating system's broken down,
Yeah.
you know, and you need an engineer to come out, you know, people can often be really concerned, you know, think, you know, not to be ageist, but I think a lot of customers in those days, certainly that from my memory it was elderly customers who would be more inclined to, you know, have the protection in place, you know, and you can just imagine, you know, my grand's nearly 90
Yeah.
now, you know, my grandmother's nearly 90 now, and you know, I wouldn't want her sitting up in our house without her central heating or,
Yeah.
you know, her cooker, you know, or not being able to make a cup of tea or something, you know, because she's got an issue with the electrics, whatever that may be, you know, whatever that is that you're supporting people with, you know, you've got to, I think often for me, it was always about placing myself in the position of the customer, you know, and obviously if somebody doesn't want a product when you're an outbound, that's fine, it's the individual's choice. You know, for me, it was never about coercing people or trying to missell to people. It was always about highlighting the, you know, the benefits of the product, the features and the benefits of the products that you were selling, you know, and giving people that opportunity to make a decision based on those features and benefits. Are they suitable for the customer? Does the customer want this product, you know?
Can you remember that? You mentioned the transition, and it's an area I love talking about this. That kind of going from one of the boys, one of the team, to then sometimes managing people that you were sat next to. How did you find that transition?
It was a difficult transition when I was sort of at that time. There was like a middle phase. So you had your agent, and then you had your senior agent, and then you had your team leader. So the senior agent would often be helping the team leader. So you'd have teams of anywhere between 15 to 20 full-time employees, sometimes maybe 15 full-time employees and maybe 3 or 4 part-time employees who would come in sort of 5 o'clock to 9 o'clock or 4 o'clock to 8 o'clock. Generally, it was a sort of 12 to 8 or 1 till 9 back in the early days. So your senior agent and the role, being in that role for quite some time as that sort of senior agent, you know, off the phones, listening to calls, call recordings, doing side-by-side sessions, so actually listening live side-by-side, you know, and doing that type of coaching and that type of senior agent role I found really difficult to begin with, because you were directly working with people you were sitting on the team with. But when I moved into the sort of, I interviewed and I got the team leader position, it wasn't as difficult, because then I was actually managing my own team, you know, and I had moved from the team that I was sitting beside onto,
It's better.
My own team. I mean, obviously still in the same department to begin with, so there was some challenges. But I think, you know, it's like any job, you've got to just face those challenges, you know. Sometimes, like any job, when you're in management level, you do have to lay things out on the line, you know, you do have to just tell it how it is, you know, this is how it is, and you know, I'm your manager, and you know, if you're going to continue to work like this, you know, if you're going to continue to ignore call quality, you know, if you're not going to say to every customer that the calls are recorded for training and quality purposes, like you need to do, you know, this is part of the job. You need to tell the customer this at the beginning of the call. If you're not going to do that, then I'm going to have to put you on to, you know, a disciplinary, you know, I'm going to have to give you a verbal warning, you know, and at some point that may turn into a meeting with HR and a written warning, you know, and sometimes that's the challenges of any job. That's not just the contact center industry, you know, there's guidelines that need to be adhered to, but I was never really, I can probably, you know, the 7 years or whatever it was, I was a team leader in domestic in general. I can count in one hand the amount of times I was in HR with people, you know. It was just, you know, I just had lots of fun, you know. That was kind of what
Yeah.
I loved about that job, you know. I had lots of fun in it. The people that I worked with were all really nice. You know, my LinkedIn profile, all 4 of my recommendations on my LinkedIn profile come from my days at Domestic in General. You know, 4 people that I worked with. One was my contact center manager, another was the account manager, and one was somebody that I directly managed, and the other one was the I can't remember what his job was, but he was in the same department as well, you know. So I think looking back now, a lot of my contacts on LinkedIn are still from those days at D&G. So yeah, it was just a really good time, good experience. And yeah, I'm going back to Brighton on the 11th of November, so 9 days time. And I'm actually hoping to meet up with a couple of people. This guy called it, I think I mentioned him earlier, Guy Amal, who I worked with on D&G Outbound, and he's still with them. And, you know, we were just chatting on the phone the other day. It's 17 years he's been there, you know. And another guy who I actually employed, I interviewed, I employed, he came into my team. Guy called Simon, and he is still with them as well, you know. And I seen his LinkedIn anniversary. It was either 11 or 12 years he's been with them, and he's an operations manager now as well, and so is Amal, an operations manager. You know, it's just really good to know that somebody that I employed, somebody that I interviewed, I gave a job, they first came onto my team, is now an operations manager in that same organization. It's really nice.
What about the person that employed you must be thinking, this is brilliant, I've seen this guy on the BBC.
Yeah, I suppose it's I can't remember who it was actually interviewed me for the role, and the first time around, when I first went there. I can't remember who it was that interviewed me, but I can remember so many people from, you know, the senior level management, and, you know, obviously the HR departments and stuff like that, because I got quite involved in a lot of that stuff. You know, one of the things that I enjoyed about working at Domestic in General in those days, and again, this has probably changed, you know, things have changed over the years in terms of how we employ people more generally across the board, not just in contact centres. But I did my own recruitment back then, so you could do your own interviews, you know, for people, and they would be people that you'd be interviewing to come onto your team. And I love doing that sort of stuff, you know. I love saying to people, yeah, you calling people up and saying you've been successful, you know. And I had some really interesting times as well back then, you know. And again, I don't know how politically correct this would be now, but there was one woman who came for an interview, you know, and obviously we were a UK-based contact centre, talking to people just in the UK, you know, but from Newcastle, Liverpool, Scotland, all around the United Kingdom. And unfortunately, the woman couldn't speak English. And, you know, it wasn't a foreign-based UK contact centre. I know a lot of contact centres now are looking for Spanish and, you know, Polish and different speakers, Italians. But this young woman couldn't speak English. So unfortunately, I was a little bit, I'm not really sure, you know, I managed to convey to her that it was a UK-based contact centre, talking to people in the UK. Yeah,
I think it points to the fact that you never know. This is what I loved about being in operations and being in that role. You never knew day to day, really, something was going to crop up that you would remember, like now, years and years later. And there was another point you made there that I just think we don't talk about enough in the industry, and that is, it is fun. It's fun, and you make lifelong friendships, you know, and your careers will go in lots of different directions, but being in that environment where you're all working together, you all, even the level of scrutiny, I mean, it has dropped a bit now in terms of there's a lot of progressive contact centers that even though they will still track a lot of the timings and, how long comfort breaks, all this sort of stuff, they don't talk to their teams about it, which I think is great. But being in that environment, you forge a togetherness that is very, very rare. You don't often see it in other industries. And that kind of, you said something earlier about incentives. I can remember I would always, even when I got to senior levels, want to spend time on the phones. I thought it was important. I thought it helped me make better decisions that would affect people on the phones. But also I thought it was good for the team to see that, you would put your money where your mouth is. And when we were doing sales though, the first shift I did 10 hours, and I really wanted to show them that I could still sell, and I was getting sales, and I was up near the top of our leaderboard. But the next day, the quality manager sent me an email saying, "Oh, could you come over and have a word?" And they said, "Look, we didn't. What they used to do was walk onto the sales floor with your call sheets and just come and sit down next to you and tell you whether you passed or failed." And you could see it in the stats, and our guys would always be all over the stats. And the quality manager, she said, "Look, we haven't released the stats because all bar one of your sales was non-compliant."
Non-compliant, yeah. I know it's what I love that, Martin. Like that was one of the things that I loved most about my role as a team leader was the incentives where I would be back on the phones, because I was always a really good seller and I was compliant as well. So,
so I sailed a bit close to the wind.
Yeah, a little bit close to the wind, but I was always compliant. And what I loved about going back on the phones and still being able to do that, once a month or once every couple of months, for a full day and giving somebody a day off and making some sales, is that I think it's really hard to manage people in any area if you've not got any experience of doing the job yourself, and that's, I think, you asked me a question earlier about sharing my experiences and the work that I do now, and I think that's what, hopefully makes me quite good at doing the work that I do now, is that I can share my personal experiences, and I've been walking on a path that, many of the people that we try and support in the charity, that they're also on that journey, and I think that's important, that you've got some level of personal experience, and I found that in my time at Domestic in General, that the best managers, the best leaders in the organisation were the people that came through the front line. The people that had started on the phones, the people that had spent some time on the phones, and were promoted up through the organisation. And I think that's really what they were good at. Myself and I know a number of other people that started on the phones and have been promoted up, like the guy that I was telling you about that I interviewed way back 11, 12 years ago now, who's now an operations manager with Domestic in General. Those are, and I'm not saying that you cannot employ management externally into the contact center industry that won't be good managers. Of course, people can come externally into any job and do a good job, but I think it's also a great asset to have had the experience of doing the job yourself that you're then managing other people to do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Let's talk then about what you do now and that kind of. So you started volunteering and then got offered a full-time job, but where's and that kind of the charity sector what's the journey there?
So yeah, the journey started with a job locally here, where I now live in Scotland, Falkirk. Um, that's where I was born and raised, and where I went through my initial challenges in life. You know, like growing up, where you know there was lots of poverty in Scotland, and you know, in the early 80s when I was growing up, you know, the coal mines were all closing down, you know, like the deindustrialization. And, you know, I went through some adverse experiences in childhood, you know, and I turned to alcohol and other drugs to cope with life, you know, and I had my own sort of problematic substance use, which you know led to not being able to hold jobs down, not being able to work consistently for periods of time, and then eventually led to homelessness and injecting drugs in horrible conditions, you know. And when I started working in this industry, or if that's the right word for it, this sector, you know, the charity work that I do now, you know, I had a couple of different jobs, you know, at the beginning. And my last job, before I became sort of well known, was an HIV outreach coordinator in Glasgow. So at the time, Glasgow was going through, and this is just a few years ago, it was going through the worst HIV outbreak that the UK's seen in 30 years amongst people who were homeless and injecting drugs in the city centre of Glasgow. So a couple of hundred cases had been detected. Nothing like this had happened for a long, long time. And then I started really looking into what was happening around the world, and you know what's happening now in 14 or 15 countries now around the world is things that are called overdose prevention centres, or in some areas safer consumption sites. Some areas call them drug consumption rooms. Now, there's no legislation in the UK for those, and the government, unfortunately, are still against them. The Westminster government, although the Scottish government are really supportive and want to set these up, the laws are not devolved to the Scottish Parliament around the Misuse of Drugs Act. So I looked at what had happened in countries like Denmark and countries like Canada, and how these things started was civil disobedience. And given that I'm a very stubborn person, and once I get something in my head, I just go for it, I went and set up the UK's first and only ever overdose prevention centre, and it was unsanctioned. I didn't have any money to do it. I started a crowdfunder, and I went and bought an old van, and I took it into Glasgow city centre, and I allowed people to come into it and inject in a sterile environment, where they could also be offered basic support, so things like protein bars and protein shakes, obviously a clean, safe area where they would get access to clean equipment, so they wouldn't be sharing equipment, so the HIV transmission wouldn't happen. And also, if somebody did take an overdose, they could be helped. And in the time that I ran that facility, which was over the course of about 10 months, we reversed 9 overdoses. So that's 9 times that had people been taking those drugs in an area where they didn't have any help or support, they could have died. And it was highly backed across Scotland and the UK, and I ended up actually being charged by police for an obstruction. The charge was later dropped, and the Crown and Prosecutor Fiscal Service said that there was no case to answer, which was good. And then after that, I ended up meeting the First Minister of Scotland, well known across the political spectrum now. And then that culminated in meeting the Queen. So I went and got to meet. I went and met the Queen. Obviously, before she passed in October last year, I met her, and I got to tell the Queen about how I was supporting homeless drug users and trying to help people you know, who are some of the most marginalized people in our communities. So yeah, I mean, it's a real roller coaster ride the last 2.5, 3 years, and you know, some of my own challenges I've had to face again, you know, with addiction, you know, and work through those again after, you know, sort of feeling that I had overcome those challenges. You know, I think some of the stuff that I was seeing on the streets of Glasgow just brought it all back to me, you know, and again, as I say, I had to face those challenges again. And now I work for, you know, the most fantastic organization like Cranston, the charity that I work for now. Again, really close to my heart. A lot of the work that Cranston delivers is across the West Midlands. And it's funny how things come full circle, because the photo that I posted on LinkedIn was actually a shop doorway in Birmingham city centre. That was where, you know, I slept for a long period of time outside that shop doorway. And now I'm working for this charity who delivers support services across the West Midlands, you know, and other areas in the UK as well. But it's funny how things just come full circle, you know, and you end up being where you're meant to be, you know. And what I'm doing now, I've just moved into a new role for the charity as a fundraising and events lead, and I am organising a massive big conference over 3 days in Brighton. And again, it's like you're coming full circle, because that's where I met my wife. That's where I got the job for, you know, and started working for Domestic in General, and where, you know, obviously my life changed. You know, my life changed massively through Domestic in General, through that first job in the contact centre industry, and through my, you know, 13 or 14 years living in Brighton. And now I'm back down in the city in February next year, organising this big massive conference, getting people from all over the world to come along to speak, to, you know, talk about the work in social justice that they're doing, you know, and not just housing and homelessness and drug addiction or drug dependency, but also, you know, the things around young people services, how we supporting young people in economic times of economic precarity for not just charities, but, you know, businesses as a whole. I'm sure the contact center industry is still feeling the effects of, you know, COVID and the redesign of how we all work these days, you know, and how are we dealing with these issues of social justice, cost of living crisis, you know, how are we dealing with domestic abuse as we come through a period of time where, you know, people have been at home, there's been more alcohol consumption, you know, people have been locked up at home often in really precarious situations with, you know, dealing with domestic abuse and dealing with adverse childhood experiences, and how we all coming together and collaborating to help, you know. And that's where, as I say, that feels like it's all came full circle for me now, you know, from that first job in Brighton to working in the charity sector to trying to bring us all together to collaborate, because everybody's got a part to play in this, Martin, from the employers like Domestic in General, who are giving people opportunities, who are coming out of the criminal justice system, who have got criminal records to come to declare, to organisations like Timson's, who are at the forefront of doing this stuff, to, you know, all the charities are coming together to exhibit and share the work that they do over the course of the weekend in Brighton, you know.
More power to you. I think it's amazing to hear what you're doing and what you've done and the lives that you've positively affected, even though, as you said, that kind of meant that you had to revisit some of your own traumatic times. So, I mean, as an industry, I think I would like to think that there's going to be people contacting you after this, and from our industry, I know I'd love to find out more about what you and the charity do and support however we can, because I think, as you mentioned, you know, the birth of us talking is because of Domestic in General saying let's take a chance, and then not only that, but also empowering you. And now here you are empowering as many people as possible to try and elicit change in a wider sense for our society, to help people that definitely need it and don't get it.
Yeah, and that excuse me, that is my hope. You know, I hope that we can see not just charities coming together, but organizations as a whole. Excuse me, but
No worries.
organizations as a whole, you know, I think we've all got a part to play here. We've all got a part.
And what would you, if you're, as a final message for people, you know, some of the previous podcasts actually are around kind of recruitment and how do we position ourselves as an industry to say we're a good place to work, but there are still contact centres that are still not as progressive as D&G were back then. What would you be saying to people in positions that can recruit in our industry right now?
I think you need to look beyond the challenges of the individual. You know, you need to see the person. If somebody's applying for a job, they've went through the trouble of filling out an application, you know, they're turning up at an interview. As long as somebody's got that basic skill, you know, that basic level of communication, that's all I had when I went to Domestic in General. I never had any work experience. I never had any, you know, like anything really to offer apart from a basic level of communication, you know, and all I had to offer was that I needed an opportunity, you know, and I think that's what we all have to do. We have to recognize that people need opportunities. You know, there's lots of scope out there for people just like me, you know, people who excuse me, people who have went through these challenges, who have not had the best starts in life often, who, you know, who have been challenged through adverse childhood experiences, who have been challenged through the criminal justice system, who, you know, have had dependency issues, you know, and that simple little opportunity that somebody said who was interviewing me that day, I would love to find who, you know, like who that was. I would love to be able to find out who the person was that interviewed me, who gave me that opportunity. Because I feel a little bit emotional talking about it now, because that one chance totally changed my life.
I love that. And you said something earlier about kind of two key phrases, words, is hope and role model. And I think anyone listening to this would absolutely buy into this and agree what a great role model you are. I've got to ask, were you, before you met the Queen, did you have to pinch yourself? What am I doing here?
Yeah, I mean, that was a surreal moment, to be honest. You know, I've met politicians across the board. You know, I've worked closely with like Paul Sweeney, who was a former Labour MP. He's now a Labour MSP. You know, I've met the leader of all the Scottish political parties, Douglas Ross from the Conservatives, Anna Sarwar, Labour, you know, Alex Cole-Hamilton, who I consider a good friend, from the leader of the Scottish Lib Dems, Nicola Sturgeon. I've met on a couple of occasions. You know, I've been to Westminster, I've met various MPs at Westminster, I've spoke at a Westminster event. You know, but meeting the Queen, I was standing in the line and Prince Charles was there. Obviously, he's the king now, but Prince Charles and the Queen were there, and the Queen was going down one side, and Prince Charles was, at the time, Prince Charles, King Charles now, was going down the other side. And I was put on one side, and I actually secretly was like, I really hope the Queen comes down my line, because you know,
yeah.
But then when she was coming down, you know, I've never been overawed by meeting any politician or any public figure that I've met, you know, on having been on TV on multiple occasions now, never overawed by it, you know, but the sweat was running down my back when I was standing in line to meet the Queen, because it is surreal, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
she at that point had been on the throne for 70 years, you know. I think I was probably one of the last handful of people who met her at a public engagement, you know, and you know, obviously things like that don't happen to people from, you know, council estates and from small villages in Scotland, you know, who have been through, you know, the things that I've been through in earlier life, and the challenges that I kind of, you know, I'm still here to tell the tale of. So yeah, very surreal, very nerve-wracking that was.
Well, this is what a life-affirming episode this has been. Peter, thanks so much for coming on. And as I said, more power to you. Keep doing the stuff you do. And I think it's amazing. Thank you for everything you do.
Yeah, no, thanks again for asking me, Martin. It's actually been really, really nice to come on and chat to you today, and brought back lots of great memories for me.
Brilliant. Have a great day.
Thank you.